very excited today to be here speaking with Patti Warashina, a real pathfinder in the world of ceramics and a real icon in that world. And I'm a huge fan, so I'm going to be an unabashed fangirl. I can't help it. Um, I'm very excited to talk to you, Patti, today. My name is Deborah Rosinski. I'm Executive Director of Bainbridge Arts and Crafts, and we are thrilled to be kicking off our 75th year in operation with a one-woman show of Patti's work. So, Patti, I would love to have you tell us a little about your background. And I will say I admire you in particular, how you as a woman in ceramics and in fine art sculpture, how you broke new ground, not only in the kind of work you did, but for other women to have a path forward. And it was a tough time to do that. So kudos to you on that, that you've had this clear vision all these years in your work. And I will ask you to dive in and tell me a little bit more about what inspired you in the direction that you've taken.
Well, I accidentally fell into art. I was, grew up in Spokane, and in that time before you were born, art and music and things like that was very suppressed in that area. It was a farming town, it's a railroad center and trucking center, and it was a large city. It was the second largest city outside Seattle and Tacoma. And but it was inland, it's by the Idaho border, and there wasn't a lot of big culture at that time. I mean, there was some, but not like what it is today. But so at that time, my father being he was from Japan, and he educated himself here in the United States and became a dentist, and moved over had arranged marriage with my mother from Tacoma, and they moved over to Spokane because there was a small Japanese immigrant population there, and they needed a dentist. And so this was before the war, and at that time, my parents, because it was very difficult, especially during the war, and just being immigrants, they really thought that was really important was education. And so they kind of programmed the three of us. I was the youngest of three. My sister is 8 years older than I, and my brother's 2 years older. And they wanted us to not suffer, when we grew up. And so they really stressed education and that we were going to go on to college. And so when I was in grade school, I used to be selected to go to the back room and go on the bulletin board, and I would work with maybe 2 or 3 other children, and we would do, say, Thanksgiving or Christmas murals, and that was fun, and we would have an art class once in a while, but not very often. And so I really didn't even think about art as a eventual occupation. So I really did all my studies in academics, like science and math and, foreign language, like most children at that time. And with the idea that I was going to go on to college. And so when I got into high school, I didn't take any art at all. And eventually I came over to the University of Washington, where my father really wanted us to come to the West Coast because it was a larger Asian population, and also was a good university. And so my sister, being ahead of me, by 8 years, she became a lab tech, and she was my mentor. And so I was going to either be, my sister said, no, be a dental hygienist. So that was what I had in mind. And my brother was supposed to be a doctor or a dentist. He became, ultimately, went into industrial design. But anyway, to make a long story short, I got to the university, and I had taken an elective outside of my program area, and I took one in they signed me up for a drawing class, and I took it from John Constantine, who's Dow Constantine's father. And Dow Constantine is, as you know, is a large, very big time politician here in the state of Washington. And so John Constantine was a painter, and that was my first drawing class. And he would set up these still lives, and maybe once in a while we might go outside, but mainly still lives. And I fell in love with this drawing class. I had never experienced anything like this before. And so then I, out of curiosity, as I was taking these other classes that were required, I took a design class, and I didn't know what design was. And it scared me because it's such an esoteric word. And I loved it. I loved it. So I guess kept taking a little bit more classes on the side in the art. And eventually I saw that ceramic studio, and I would go in there and watch these people on the wheel throwing clay. And I went, wow, this looks like fun, So I took a ceramics class, and I never left. That was it. Once I touched that material, I fell in love with it. I would go in there at nighttime. I would go in, sneak in on the weekends. We were allowed to go into the art building on the weekends if you're an undergraduate. And I would sneak in there, and I finally got to a time where this is so funny. I had a studio down in the basement of the ceramic lab, and it didn't have any windows. It had one door going into it. And I could hear the man, at nighttime, you could hear the campus police come through, and I could hear them with the keys. I had to go through a big studio door. And then finally you would get to my studio door, and I could hear the jingling of the keys. And I would jump into my locker. It was these oak lockers. And my wheel was dirty and kind of spinning around, and the lights were on in there, and the campus policeman would come in there, and he would stand there and look around the building, around the room like this, looking for somebody. There was nobody there. I was in the locker. And then he would leave. I could hear the door slamming, 2 doors slamming, and then finally go back on the wheel. So that's how much fun I had on the wheel, and learning to conquer this machine, and try to learn to control it. And eventually later on, I had this friend, John Booker, who he was also a fellow student, and John and I would race to see who could throw the tallest cylinder. We had to be, so we'd take about like 15 pounds of clay and put it on the wheel head, and then we'd race to see who could make up the tallest thing, and we had to cut it down. So that one of our projects in class was actually Bob Sperry. One of our problems was to throw 12-inch cylinders, and they could not taper. They had to be half-inch from top to bottom. And we had to cut it down in front of it. So anyway, John and I used to have these contests to see who could do it. Anyway, so I had all this fun, in there. And so eventually, the thing that drew me into the ceramics lab was that throwing, learn to manipulate shape and all that. And eventually what happened is I was told to take, painting classes, because, we couldn't just dip a pot in a pot of glaze and pull it out and throw it in the kiln. It had to be decorated. So the stress was on learning how to control brushstrokes. And at that time, it was Japanese Mingei pottery that was very, very popular around the world, even in England and the United States. East Coast, Alfred University, really stressed Mingei pottery. And Shoji Hamada and some of these incredible folk potters that everybody admired were emulated. And so I was very, very fortunate that at that time Bob Sperry got into film, and Bob eventually and I got married way later on. But anyway, Bob got really interested in film and experimental film too. But at that time, he went to Japan. It was about 1962, and went to Onda to film, the Onda, and did a fabulous job making this Mingei pottery film. And at the same time, what happened, the University of Washington was having this kind of not a festival, but some kind of program where they were inviting people from Japan to come over. And Hamada, I was so lucky to have him as an instructor for a quarter. What a gift to be around somebody that beautiful, and he did things with such ease. He would sit at the potter's wheel with his legs crossed, and he'd go like this, stirring the wheel around and around, and it was, I was fascinated with his work. And the funny thing about him was he never got a speck of clay on his clothes. He had his kimonos on, and he never had there's no clay on him. It was amazing. And here I come in blue jeans, and it's really funny when I'm thinking back about this. When I was an undergraduate at that time, women were not allowed to wear pants. I mean, this is bizarre when I think back. I remember thinking, going to the clothes, we had a little clothes closet on the side of the studio, just a little cupboard. And women would go in there and change their skirts to pants. And I remember one time, this is what brings it all to my mind. I had something at the office that I had to go pick up. It was a piece of mail or something. And I thought to myself, now should I put change to a skirt and go get my mail? And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to wear my pants and go up the thing and pick my meal up and come back down to the studio. And that was the kind of time it was. Women were, really were not. Well, that was the way of the times. So that's the kind of thing that I grew up in. And I did have a woman, Jean Griffith, who I highly respect. She was a wife who was she was in grad school at the time. She was ahead of me about 3 years. She was in grad school, and Jean must have been about in her late 30s, and she had children, and they were in school. And I always remember Jean because she was, was a man's, it was a man's territory, like kills, and, getting dirty, and, and I remember Jean wouldn't take any kind of, say, SH from
no guff.
I couldn't think of that word. But anyway, she wouldn't take guff from anybody, from any guy. And she just knew what she wanted to do. And she was a fabulous artist. And she also did raku. And she had read about it in Bernard Leach's book. And so she started experimenting and did these fabulous walls and experimental work in ceramics. And so she was kind of my mentor, as a woman. But also, later on, her work was seen by other well-known artists who I won't even mention, who really took a lot of credit for what Jean did. So I have to give her credit for a lot of my inspiration. I guess that was longer than I thought.
It's great to hear who inspired you. And, I really think a lot of artists have that kind of lineage of inspiration. Somebody sets an example for them, and then they in turn set example for others. And there's so much power in that kind of mentor-mentee relationship.
And there was something about Jean's personality, she was very, very, she had a way of scolding somebody, but she would be laughing kind of. so you never, she was serious, dead serious, but you didn't take it, forever after that she was this witch.
She took the sting.
Oh.
Well, I remember I read something that you said about in your youth, you had been at a relative's home and they had a Buddhist altar, and something about it in looking at it, you realized kind of the power of objects, and it made a big impression on you. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, actually, it was my grandmother. My grandmother was also an immigrant, and she came over very young, fairly young, and she had 3 children, and my mother being one. And I remember my grandmother, after the war, my grandmother moved to Spokane, and she had a house that she rented. And I remember she had this in their dining room, she had this wall of cupboards, that you could just open up. And I remember as a little kid, we were in our family, in the Spokane, the Japanese community was divided into 2 groups, the Buddhist group and the Christian group. And the 2 groups did not mix at that time. You just didn't interact. They had their own social, parties and meetings, etc. But they didn't mix. And I remember my grandmother started going to the Methodist church where we went, and I attended every Sunday. And so I remember going over to my grandma's cupboard, and I opened it up, and there was this Buddhist shrine. And here she was supposedly going to the Christian church, and it was kind of shocked me. And I remember looking at it because it was so elegant and so beautiful. It was black and had gold decoration on it, and you open it up, it's gold inside. And I was fascinated because I was really, as a kid, I was not, we just didn't mix. I didn't go to the Buddhist church, so I never knew what it would really look like. And so when I was really fascinated, and it was very kind of magical. And then to this day, I have a fascination. I mean, I'm not religious at all. I'm totally too dumb. So anyway, I'm not religious at all, but I have a fascination for religious art. I love looking at Christian art. I love looking at, I love I don't know what it is about, but they do fascinate. There's something about, there's a certain kind of spirit that people give to these objects. And so it's not that I collect it, but when I see something that I like, you just grab it. But I'm kind of a hoarder. Oh, here's a piece of African art that I bought a long time ago from Renee Brodman, who taught African art at the University of Washington. He had a fellow who was a trader that he knew from Africa. And I just happened to find this the other day in one of my cupboards. I had it stuck away. After about 30 years, I finally found it. But, it's supposed to be a pregnant woman. It's a gourd. And, so these kind of things really fascinate me. I something about ethnic art that's really captivating.
Yeah, I agree. I'm definitely consumed by curiosity about, the different traditions that people develop and where they take them. And in looking at your work, you're doing a lot of narrative content, a lot of figurative forms. And would you say you are kind of intuitive in how you go about working? You let the process take you?
Yeah, it's I started out in clay, and I started out with a throwing, and it was kind of this manner of trying to capture, or trying to control the use of making these forms. And once I got into that, and then I got into learning how to paint on, I never was very good at it, but decorate the surface. I fell into, I started taking painting classes, and at that time was abstract expressionism. You throw a brushstroke, and you have to be beautiful brushstroke, and it was all came out of New York, right? The New York scene. And so that was what was happening. Alden Mason was very, very well known here in the Seattle area, and some other painters. But that's how I was trained. I wasn't trained as a figurative artist at all. And so I had a friend, Ed Thacker, who was a painter. He was a student painter, and we used to talk about art, and I remember he had a whole slurry of books. He loved art books, and we used to go look at them, and I remember going through them, and I found there's this thing called surrealism, and it wasn't so much surrealism, but there's something about Dada and all these kind of crazy, where they're using figurative, representational objects. And then here you're in school and you're trained not to paint objects. You're there to learn how to pull a brushstroke. And so this really came a little bit later on when I was taking painting. I found this area and I thought, that guy. In fact, I remember I used to get criticized. You're making that stroke too tight. Like it's not loose enough, or maybe that stroke doesn't have the gesture it should have. And then I started questioning it. I started thinking, I started looking at Magritte. I love Magritte. And I started looking at his work. And I'm like, this guy doesn't make loose strokes. I mean, he's as tight as it can be, And so then I started questioning all this thing about art, like what is it, And so when I was in school, I didn't take it. I took one figurative class, I think from Everett to Penn. It was a very beginning class. In fact, I don't even think it was a figure class. I think it was just a general sculpture class. I'm good to abstract, forms and stuff. But it really wasn't till later, until I got out of school, that was through the painting and through looking at two-dimensional work that I started getting fascinated with that kind of imagery, using the figure. And then it was a matter of like, okay, how are you going to do it? Well, and it started out really very slowly. If you look at the early ceramic work that I did in hand building, I wanted to learn how to build with slabs. And so I would roll out slabs and then try to form it into these forms. So it was like teaching yourself, how to control material. Instead of throwing, it would be hand building. Like, can I build this 3 feet high? Can I make these forms, these geometric forms out of them? And just kind of teaching yourself. And then that led on to still looking at a painting. I was looking at Magritte and people like that. And at that time, it was pop art. Coke bottles, and Bob Arneson down in the Bay Area, there was that funk art music movement going. And I loved it because it's so, cynical. And I'm a cynic myself. And so it kind of fell into place, and but I was still trying to learn how to control this material. And now that early work, I would start doing these large lips, and that was a part of the figure. It's part of your face. And so I was trying to learn to control the mouth, and later on it extended itself into dogs, like just to see if I could form a dog, an abstract dog, and using this technique, the slab, learning how to build with slabs. And so it's kind of just teaching yourself, how to make these things. And then finally, the thing that was a turning point for me for the figure was I decided that I was afraid to do the figure. Human figures are so complex, and the muscles move. There's nothing stable about the figure. And so I thought, well, I'm going to make a car. I'll just make a car because it's abstract form. I could build it out of slabs, and I'm building these kind of curvilinear forms. So I'll just build a car. And that started it. Once I built that car, it built my confidence. And then I had to build, next idea was to build a figure inside the car. Well, these cars were about, say, 25, 30 inches long, and they had tires on them. And I put them in acrylic cases, because I didn't want I had flames coming out. Anyway. And so I was really afraid to do that figure, and that's why these figures at that time turned out to be about 12 inch to 14 inches high, because they had to fit inside the car. So when I started thinking about this car, there was a guy from California that I met in high school, and I was living in Spokane at the time, and he hears from California. Well, I'm really impressed. Here's a guy from California. And we started talking, and I was asking about his girlfriend. And so he pulled his wallet out of his back pocket, and he pulled it out, and he pulled this picture out, this photograph of her. And she's sitting on the top of his car. And so when I was doing this car, I don't know what happened, but I thought back about that time in high school, about this girl sitting on top of a car, on the hood of a car. And that was the first figure I made. and that was called the clothesline robbery. She's sitting on top of it, and she's running through this clothesline. And so that's how that whole series started, with a figure. So once I did that first figure, I gave me confidence, and that's when I started really diving into making figures. And I did that figure for about 10 years, doing various compositions with them, and they finally got pretty elaborate. I think it was 72 figures I did for a commission that the city gave me. And it was, I decided that it was easier to do real people's faces than to try to make up 72 heads. So I ran around Seattle asking people if I could take their photograph, artists. Took 15 photographs per person. And then I evolved that. And that's how I learned about the figure.
That piece is incredible, that each person is individually distinct. They're real Seattle luminaries, right? And I haven't seen the finished installation yet, but I've seen a lot of photos and publications about it, and I can't wait to go see it.
But that's how I learned about the figure. It's because of that first car that I made, that I put the figure on, and that just kind of stoked the fuel. And so anyway, then I got burned out. I was burned out after doing that piece. It took me a year and a half to do that piece. And I decided I had to jump scale. So that's when I started to jump scale. And I decided at that time, I didn't want them to be realistic. I wanted to be modified. I didn't know what was going to happen. And also I wanted to learn to build larger pieces. So I think the first figures were about 3 feet high. And then after that, I jumped more scale, and I jumped to, say, 8 feet. So it was a matter of just kind of teaching yourself all these but I knew that I wanted my figures to be modified eventually, and I didn't know where it was going to end up. It's where I am now. I'm still trying to modify my figures, but I think what I'm trying to do is try to not put myself I live in a contemporary time, and so I think that's the feeling I have about my figures, that I want them to kind of identify a time that I live in. And so I think that's why I keep trying to simplify the work.
I'm struck by the fearlessness with which you go about these pieces, the scale, and all the technical challenges that creates for you. I mean, it's
like a game, It's like it's no fun to do the same thing. Or I find that because the curiosity, it's like trying to solve a puzzle. And so when you go down to the studio, it's like, okay, how can I, if I want, you get these crazy ideas in your head, and you think, well, I wonder if I can do it. And so that's what it's about.
I'm also struck by your, rebellious spirit that comes through much of the work, and the humor, so much humor and sarcasm and insight.
Definitely know of that. Well, part of it too is, there's so much angst in the world, and so much, I don't know, there's so much disasters, and people, it's sad. And I think underneath, if you look closely at the work, sometimes you feel that, there's a certain kind of cynicism that I use in my work, but I try to keep the work, when you look at it, like it doesn't strike you as being horrifying. But if you look close enough, there's a little bit of hurt in there, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
I think
packed with emotion. Definitely.
Even like the cats, I haven't figured out a dog. I've done dogs before, but dogs are so sweet and nice, and cats have a little bit of, they kind of, they kind of standoffish, and there's something nice about that. I mean, I like that kind of, like, you're kind of nuts, you're looking at people, and there's a certain kind of personality cats have that I'm fascinated by, and yet I don't want a cat, probably because of that reason. I'd rather have a dog, but I don't know if it explains anything to you, but
Do you have animals that you
um,
live?
I've had both dogs and cats, but I don't at this time. It's like having a child, and I don't have time for child right now. I'm the child. Don't have time for myself.
Well, you're so active and prolific, and really it's our spaces here, we're testing our own limits to show your work because we don't have a loading dock and we don't have,
That's a good place.
easy entry into the spaces.
Maybe
Uh,
that's-
for us, it's a really great challenge because, we most of us on staff are artists, and we're all huge fans of what you do, and the chance to show your work here, it's
Oh,
just
thank you for inviting me.
well. So, and the influence you've had and the program that you created at the University of Washington, it's opened doors, I think, for so many others in ceramics to break boundaries and try new things. And
I
so,
think teaching was the one of the best things that I ever. I mean, I was so lucky that here you're around students that are really curious. They're always asking you questions, and and you're not trying to make clones out of them, right? And so what you're trying to do is draw them out to bring out their own personalities into their work, and you try to guide them that way. And there was something always refreshing about students, and I think that's part of what made me the way I am, is that they were always asking questions. And so you kind of, after you done 35 years worth of it, you're still asking yourself questions. And so you try to answer them. And so it was a really an amazing time that I had teaching. I loved it. In fact, it's really funny because after teaching 35 years, and Bob was, he was on his very, very ill. And he says, Pat, you taught 35 years, why don't you just quit? And I thought about it. So, I really enjoy teaching. And I thought I would really miss Jamie Walker and Akio Takamori, who I was teaching with at the time. And but anyway, for some reason I said, okay, I think I will just go ahead and tell them that I'm going to resign. So I went in and did it. And then 1 year, 1 year later goes by. And I said, hey, you guys, I don't miss you at all.
well, you're in the next chapter.
No, I do. They're really great guys to work with. I was very fortunate because I had such great people to teach with. I taught with Bob, and I taught with Howard Kotler. What a gift. And people that really enjoyed, their spirit and their talent. It's so we all kind of bounced off on each other, and then later on, Howard passed away, and then Jamie Walker came, and he's such a very brilliant guy. He's director of the art school now, which is a job that, oh God, I don't know how anybody does that job. And then Akio Takamori, who was just an amazing artist and such a cool guy and delight to work with. So I was very, very lucky that I had such, and Harold Myers. I can't tell you how much Harold Myers meant to me as a student. He was a protege of Peter Voulkos. Bob hired him. Bob was head of the department at that time when I was a student. And Louis Haffermel was a painter. He came in to teach at the university. But Harold Myers was brought up from California and taught with Bob. And Harry used to make these things which were called piles. They were like cow piles. And they were great. They sound horrifying, but they were wonderful. Everybody was doing stoneware at the time. Nobody did anything but stoneware and reduction. And but there was a way that Harry Myers touched the clay. Like he would, he'd make these piles, but the way it stretched the form, it's gorgeous. And so, I learned so much from everybody, and Bob and Howard, and I was lucky. I was so lucky to be around these wonderful people.
Well, I'm sure they were lucky to be around you as well, as are we. And I've enjoyed talking with you so much. Thank you for sharing some of your memories with us, and stories, and your work, which will be
Was
on view soon. We're going to have it on view from January 6th through February 14th.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me too. I'm anxious to come. Take care. Good luck. Good luck setting it up.
Yeah, we're getting some extra muscle in to help us. So,
Okay, you take care.
thank
All
you,
right.
Patti.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. We hope you'll stop into Bainbridge Arts and Crafts to see a spectacular exhibition of ceramic sculpture by Patti Warashina, on view from January 6th through February 14th.